my parents, and golden child. Brother tried stealing my house with fake lease papers and crocodile tears, so I stood firm, exposed their lies, and left them broken behind. I'm a single man in my early 30s. My younger brother's 29, and he already has 4 children. He had his first at 22, the second a year later, the third 2 years after that, and the fourth was just born a couple of months ago. His wife and I don't get along at all. She constantly tries to provoke me by acting superior, and the moment I push back, she morphs into a dramatic, self-victimizing performer. She can cry on demand and put on such a believable act that she gains instant sympathy from nearly everyone. Despite knowing exactly how manipulative she is, my parents and brother absolutely adore her and don't seem to care. I'll admit she's attractive, but her personality is so awful that I could never be drawn to her. She refuses to work, even though she has a college degree, and since my mom gladly helps care for the kids all day, their entire financial situation relies solely on my brother. Because of this, they can't afford a place of their own and still live in my parents' house. Privacy is practically non-existent, with everyone crammed under one roof in a small 3-bedroom house built in the 1960s. Growing up, my brother was clearly the golden child. We're only 3 years apart, but he developed a serious superiority complex early on. Whenever I pushed back against his behavior, I was the one who got harshly punished. It was painfully obvious my parents favored him. He got the lion's share of attention and resources, unless someone from the extended family noticed and called it out, which happened more often than you'd think. In response, my parents packed us up and moved 150 miles away, so they wouldn't have to deal with that scrutiny anymore. After that, we only saw most of the family during holidays since it was a 3-hour drive. My brother was physically abusive toward me multiple times. He even flirted with my first girlfriend so aggressively that she broke up with me. He laughed at every bit of misfortune I faced, and my parents always told me to toughen up whenever I complained. The only times I received equal treatment were when they needed to keep up appearances. It was oddly satisfying to watch them fake fairness during birthdays or Christmas just because nosy relatives were around. Those same relatives loved drama and gossip, so my parents made sure to threaten me into silence. They told me they'd take away everything I owned if I dared to speak out. Honestly, I think they were thrilled when I turned 18 and moved out because they didn't have to support me anymore. I hadn't even finished high school at the time, but couch surfing was still better than living under their roof. Since then, I've kept minimal contact. They didn't bother showing up to my high school graduation, but I didn't care. After that, I only saw them during family holidays like everyone else. Then came 2020, and the pandemic hit me hard. I lost my job and couldn't afford to renew my lease. My roommate lost his job too, and we just couldn't keep up with the rent on our 2-bedroom condo. I had really loved that place. He moved back in with his relatives before the lease was even up, and I had to sell almost everything I owned just to avoid ending up on the street. Looking back, I shouldn't have rented such an expensive place, but I had been enjoying the high life until it all came crashing down. I realized too late that I should have been living somewhere cheaper and saving money. Still, I had a plan. I owned a pickup truck, because I've always had a thing for trucks, and I found a camper in good shape for just $1,000. I mounted it on the back of my truck and planned to live in it temporarily. That temporary plan ended up lasting way longer than I ever imagined. My first hope was to park and live out of the camper at my parents' place, where my brother and his family still lived. But when I asked them if I could stay there for a while, they flat out refused. They said the house was full and made it clear they didn't want me there. On top of that, they reminded me that we hadn't exactly been on good terms for the past decade. They told me they had only allowed me to park my camper there if I paid them basically the equivalent of renting an apartment in my area, which was completely outrageous. I was unemployed and trying to stretch my unemployment money until I found a new job, so that kind of rent just to park my camper made no sense. I might as well have rented an actual apartment. My parents called my camper an eyesore and told me to get lost since we couldn't come to an agreement. They actually thought it was hilarious that I had to live in a camper. My brother joined in, laughing and pointing, calling me a homeless bum. I ended up parking my truck camper in a store parking lot to sleep that first night with nowhere else to go. I was terrified someone might try to break in, and unsurprisingly, I didn't sleep a wink. I had no other options. My other relatives lived too far away, and all of my friends lived in apartments. I was also pretty attached to my area and didn't want to leave. I had my mail forwarded to a friend's apartment. That was the only way I could still receive any correspondence. Finding a safe, stable spot to park was incredibly tough. I searched everywhere for a job similar to my last one. It took months of living the nomadic camper life, and in that time I dealt with just about everything, from aggressive beggars and drug addicts to people angrily demanding I move because my camper was an eyesore. One guy even claimed to be with the HOA, though I wasn't even parked on a residential street. When I questioned him about which HOA he supposedly represented, he got hostile and threatened me. I moved the camper, just to avoid any problems. To keep my camper batteries charged, I had to get creative. I used a long extension cord to plug into any outside outlet I could find, usually from some random building while parked on the street. I know it wasn't exactly ethical, but it was either that or let the food in my mini fridge spoil. I had a small solar power bank for my phone, but I didn't have a generator, and even if I did, they're loud and require fuel. So I did what I had to. After months of living like that, I finally found a new job. I had to relocate to a neighboring city to get hired somewhere that wasn't retail. I had worked in retail during college and swore I'd never go back, though I was pretty close to breaking that promise. I was still collecting unemployment at the time, but didn't want to be jobless when it ran out. Besides, I was incredibly bored. I had nothing to do all day except read, watch movies on a little portable DVD player, scroll through my phone or laptop, and keep track of places to park in nearby public bathrooms. Honestly, I envied how Japan has public bathhouses. We could really use something like that here. When I landed the job, I practically lived in the back parking lot of the building near the warehouse. The space was in the old employee section, so far in the back that most people forgot it even existed. The company owner, who was also my boss, actually liked the setup. I was always nearby and ready to take any shift they needed me for, as long as I got enough sleep. He even let me remove the camper from my truck and set it up in one of those unused spots so I could drive around freely. I'm not entirely sure if any of this was legal, but no one ever gave us trouble. Living back there, I didn't have many issues with trespassers. A few showed up here and there, but security always escorted them off the property. I was basically on call all the time and worked nearly every day of the week. My boss let me plug the camper into the building for both power and water. Instead of traditional rent, I worked for free on Sundays, when the office was closed except for the janitor and a security guard. As for hygiene, I usually showered at a friend's apartment or at the gym, since my camper didn't have a shower. It only had a portable toilet, which I avoided using unless absolutely necessary. Emptying it is a disgusting task, so I preferred using public restrooms. I had a key to the warehouse and could go in at any hour to use the bathroom. I even got to know the staff well and was on a first-name basis with voice before, especially not around my family, but this time I let it rip. The night security guard, who I mentioned earlier, had become one of my closest friends through all of this. The camper itself was easy to heat during winter with a small electric heater, but summer was brutal. There was no built-in AC, so I bought a used portable air conditioner just to survive the heat. Thankfully, with all the overtime I was working, I started earning decent money and picked up new skills from my coworkers. Around mid-year, I was promoted to a supervisor position, which came with a much better salary than I had at my old job. That's when I decided it was time to get a house. Losing my condo during the pandemic shook me, and I realized I needed long-term stability. I started house hunting and found a 3-bedroom manufactured home on a small property just 2 miles from work. I negotiated it down by $10,000 and managed to put down nearly all of my savings as a deposit. I got approved for a home loan and finally didn't have to live in a camper anymore. There was even enough room in the backyard to detach the camper from my truck and set it up like a little standalone unit, just in case I ever needed it again. Break. Once I was fully settled in, I made the mistake of posting about the house on Facebook. That's when everything went downhill. A few weeks later, my parents, brother, and his entire family showed up at my house completely unannounced. I never gave them my address, so to this day I don't know how they found out where I lived. None of my friends admitted to leaking it, and no family had visited before. So I honestly suspect they might have followed me home from work or something creepy like that. When I opened the door, they barged in like overexcited tourists and immediately started snooping around. They made themselves comfortable without even asking, and my brother's wife kept flashing me this smug, unsettling smile. I wouldn't understand the meaning behind it until later, and when I did, I was furious. My parents kept going on and on about how much space I had now, that it was way too big for someone like me, especially since I wasn't married and had no kids. My brother kept pointing out that my house was bigger than our parents', and even mentioned how it was much closer to his job. The red flags were waving in my face, but I didn't piece it together right away. Then my brother asked if we could speak privately. As soon as he said that, the rest of them conveniently stepped outside onto the porch like they'd rehearsed the whole thing. That's when it hit me. They'd planned something. Dan, my brother, told me straight up that the house was too much space for one person and that he and his family should move in. His reasoning? His wife was pregnant with their 4th child, and my house was conveniently close to his work. He added that since I had the camper, I could just move into that and let them have the house. And just to be clear, Dan never once mentioned paying rent. The man has a decent job, yet still expected me to just hand over my home. He even started talking about making rules and enforcing curfews, saying I wouldn't be able to just walk in whenever I wanted without prior notice. If it had been anyone else saying these things, I'd think they were completely delusional. But this was Dan, and he'd been groomed to think the world revolved around him by our parents. I tried to respond, but he kept talking over me like I wasn't even allowed to speak. There was no way I was going to rent my house, or any part of it, to him. Maybe I'd consider it for other tenants in the future to help pay off my mortgage, but definitely not to him or his toxic wife. I'd seen too many videos online about people getting taken advantage of in exactly this way, and I always thought that could never happen to me. But now, I was living it. And it was just as outrageous as those stories made it seem. I quietly picked up my phone and started recording, just in case. Dan didn't even notice. He just kept going, waving his arms around while listing all the reasons why he needed my house. He even switched from pleading to acting like the deal was already done, then reached out to shake my hand like we had agreed. That's when I finally stood up for myself. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "Hell no," loud and clear. Dan actually stumbled back a little, probably shocked because I'd rarely raised my voice before, especially not to him. Never used to raise my voice to him like that because, growing up, I'd always get punished by our parents for even trying. But this was my house, not theirs. I could stand my ground all I wanted here. I told him flat out that my house wasn't up for negotiation, and pretending like I'd just roll over and hand it to him because he wanted, it wasn't going to make it happen. I bought this place for myself. It's not my fault he keeps having more kids and still can't afford to move out of our parents' place. Dan got right up in my face, almost close enough to touch me, and said I didn't deserve the house, that he needed a better place for his family. I laughed right back and told him that was complete garbage. I worked my ass off to buy this home, so of course I deserved it. He started yelling that I had no wife or kids and didn't need all this space, so I may as well give it to him. I made it crystal clear that I wasn't giving him anything. He never even offered to pay rent. If I let him move in, I'd still be covering the entire mortgage while being kicked out of my own house. Then, Dan said something even more outrageous, that he shouldn't have to pay rent because his family comes first, and our parents told him I was going to do this and that I would. He said it like their word was law. I snapped and told him they had no right or authority to give my house away to anyone, let alone him. Break. Right then, my parents and Sil barged back through the front door and surrounded me, trying to pressure me into agreeing. What followed was a lot of shouting, but if I had to sum it up, the phrase, "just do it for Dan," was thrown at me so many times I lost count. I finally told them all they had zero say in my life or my house, and that they needed to leave before I called the police. Sil screamed the loudest, going on about how she was pregnant again and I couldn't do this to her. I told her I didn't do anything to her. She just assumed she could take from me without consequences. I had no obligation to her or her family. Then I told her flat out she was a stuck-up brat who had never shown me an ounce of respect, and I didn't care what she thought or how many kids she had. She wasn't going to live in my house. That's when she snapped. She punched me in the face and tried to come at me again, but Dan held her back while she kicked and screamed, demanding to be let go so she could scratch my eyes out. Thankfully, I had my phone recording the entire time. I held it up and told them I'd be calling the police if they didn't get out immediately. My parents finally told Dan they were leaving. My mother said I had 1 week to come to my senses. I told her I wouldn't be and to never come back. Then I looked Sil in the eye and told her I had everything on video, and if she ever tried anything again, I'd press charges for assault. She screamed at me, then stormed out of the house sobbing, hands covering her face. My mom was the last to walk out. She looked back and said, "I better do this for Dan and Sil." I just told her again, I won't. Part 2 of the story picks up right after I kicked out my parents, brother, and Sil for trying to force me to hand over my new house. I immediately went on social media and shared the entire story with the rest of the family. The post spread quickly, but you won't find it now because I eventually deleted it and locked down my profile. I posted it because I knew exactly what was coming. The first thing they'd do when they got home would be to twist the whole event and try to make me the bad guy. And I was right. But I had about an hour head start. Plus, I had the video evidence. Being proactive paid off. A good chunk of my extended family sided with me right away. My parents, Dan and Sil, probably had their own post drafted and ready to go, but by the time they saw mine, it was too late. They never even bothered trying to lie publicly after that. Sure, they had a few flying monkeys who supported them, but not many. Most of the family already knew how entitled they were, so what happened wasn't a shock to anyone. Everyone else saw it for what it was, and accepted the truth quickly. There was one person in particular who called me. I didn't know who the caller was, but they went off on a rant about how I was a terrible brother and needed to make way for a real family man. I just ended the call and blocked the number. Thankfully, no one else tried that again, but right on schedule the following week, just like they had threatened, my parents showed up at my front door with Dan. They rang the doorbell non-stop and pounded on the door until I finally answered. I cracked it open slightly, and as expected, they immediately tried to force their way in. But I'd installed a couple of latch chains and braced my body against the door, so they weren't getting through. My dad and brother barked at me to let them in. I told them I was recording everything on camera and would call the police if they tried to force entry again. My mother stepped in, using her most sickeningly sweet voice to ask if I was ready to let Dan move in. I told her, and all of them, to fumoise off and never come back. Cue the crocodile tears. My mom started sobbing, asking why I couldn't just do this for Dan, because he's my beloved brother. I laughed in her face and said I didn't love him as a brother, because he treated me like trash for years, and they all encouraged it. I called them out for being horrible parents, and him for being a horrible sibling. Then I told them to leave immediately, or I was calling the police. Surprisingly, they left without much resistance, aside from my mother's over-the-top crying and the glares from everyone else. It felt too easy, and I should have known better. Later, that same week, Friday evening, I got home and saw a moving truck and my brother's minivan parked in my driveway. Yep, Dan and his family were there, moving in. He waved at me with the smuggest grin I've ever seen. I was beyond furious. I rushed over and demanded they stop immediately. Syl just smiled at me with fake innocence and said, "Like it or not, we're moving in." Then, tilting her head and puckering her lips, she added, "It's okay because your mommy said we could, and you should always listen to what your mommy tells you." Brie egg. That smug little taunt sent me into a silent rage. I got in my truck, locked the doors, and called the police immediately. As soon as they realized what I was doing, Syl started pounding on my window and yelling at me to stop. She kept screaming that they needed the house, and through sobs asked, "Why can't you just do this for Dan?" I shouted back, "Fuck Dan, it's my damn house, not his." Then she threatened to key the side of my truck unless I stopped calling the cops. Luckily, the 911 operator heard it all. My window was slightly open. I warned her if she damaged my truck, I'd sue her. And thankfully, that was enough to get her to back off. When the cops arrived, Dan and Syl had locked themselves inside my house, with their kids. I explained everything to the officers and showed them my driver's license with my current address. When we approached the front door, I saw the locks had been changed. The old one was lying on the porch, completely drilled out, and the drill they used was still there, along with a Harbor Freight drill bit set. I pointed out the broken lock, the drill, and gave the police a full rundown of everything that had led up to this. And then, as if things couldn't get worse, my parents showed up. Dan must have called them once I arrived. The moment they got there, my parents started, lying, claiming I'd agreed to rent the house to Dan and his family. I told the officers that was a lie, and it could easily be proven. That's when Dan and Syl finally came out of the house, grinning like they'd won something. They had some printed papers in hand, and smugly announced that we had a rental agreement. They'd actually gone and made a fake lease agreement. But my signature, nowhere close to mine. It looked nothing like my handwriting. Honestly, I doubt any of them even know what my signature looks like. I told them all, bluntly, that this was laughably blatant fraud. If the police investigated, they'd easily prove the signature was fake. Then I added that if they pushed this any further, it could result in court charges, and Dan could lose his job, which was his only way of supporting his family. Go ahead and give him everything and leave me the hell alone. I told them I'd be getting a lawyer and would sue for damages if anything of mine was stolen, broken, or lost, and that I'd even call CPS for good measure. Dan went pale. He looked genuinely scared when I said all that. But my mother, as usual, stepped in between us and doubled down, insisting I should just do this for Dan and live in the camper so they could finally have a home of their own. I snapped and yelled that if she thought it was such a great idea, then she could do it for Dan. She could let him have her house instead. The officers stepped in and separated my mother from me. I then shouted that I wanted them all out of my home immediately, or I'd press charges. I made it very clear that they drilled out my front door lock to break in, that the lease papers were laughably fake, and that I had video evidence of Sil assaulting me. All of that could easily land them in jail. Those were serious felonies, and if they didn't leave, I would use them to ruin their lives. The only reason I hadn't already was because of Dan's kids. I didn't want them to suffer for their parents' stupidity. But they had one final chance to get the hell off my property. That was the moment it finally clicked for my parents. I think they realized they couldn't bully me into submission anymore. My mother backed down and said she'd put an end to it. She walked over to Sil and had a quiet conversation, while my dad went to talk to Dan. A minute later, Sil suddenly burst into tears and began tearing up the fake rental agreement into tiny pieces and throwing them in the air like confetti. One of the cops immediately told her to pick up every last piece, or he'd write her up for littering. At that point, both officers looked like they were mentally checked out, clearly wondering why they had to deal with this circus. Dan was forced to tell his kids to start reloading their stuff into the moving truck. The kids were all crying, and the oldest one was sobbing, saying he wasn't going to get his own room now. Sil and Dan tried one last pathetic move. An obvious guilt trip. I swear they must have rehearsed it. All the kids had that same sad, quivering look on their faces. Sil kept cradling her belly dramatically, tilting her head like a lost puppy. Dan wore the most pitiful expression he could muster, and softly begged, "Please, don't do this. We need somewhere to live." I didn't flinch. I told them to keep packing. Break. Suddenly, everyone turned up the waterworks. Sil and the kids started bawling even louder. Dan exploded, yelling, "Are you satisfied with yourself? You've denied us a home because you're too selfish to help your own family." I laughed out loud, full-on, unfiltered maniacal laughter. Then I fired back. "This isn't sharing, this is stealing. And no amount of fake crying is going to convince me to let you take what's mine. You're not my brother anymore. You're just an entitled jerk who thinks he can take whatever he wants, just like when we were kids." Dan began dropping F-bombs at me left and right, until one of the officers stepped in and told him to cool it or he'd be in handcuffs, whether or not I pressed charges. Dan shut his mouth immediately, lips pressed tight, looking both terrified and furious. I asked the cops if they could stay until my parents, Dan and Sil, were all gone, and they assured me they weren't going anywhere until this was completely over. Then, just a few minutes later, 2 more squad cars pulled up, bringing the total to 4 officers on site. Whether it was protocol or just the drama escalating, the added presence seemed to finally motivate my family to take the situation seriously. I told Dan to hand over the key to the new lock he'd installed on my front door. He hesitated. Then, instead of handing it to me, he actually threw the keys down the street and into a storm drain, muttering, "Go get them yourself." One of the cops immediately scolded him and made him retrieve them. He had to lift the grate and reach down into the drain, getting himself filthy in the process. When he finally returned, he slammed the keys into my hand without saying a word. I looked each of them in the eye and told them, again, to leave and never come back. My mother, trying to land one last blow, told me I'd be disowned for this, as if that was supposed to scare me. I rolled my eyes and shot back, "Oh no, guess that means I won't get to join you all for the holidays, where I'm always treated like crap anyway, because Dan's your golden boy." Then, in a cold, sarcastic tone, I added, "You treated me so terribly growing up that if Dan ever needs an organ donor, he won't be getting anything from me." And with that, I shut the door. They were about to drive away. I stood there silently, arms crossed, watching every last one of them with a cold stare. It was surreal, honestly, seeing them all crumble under the weight of the same cruelty they used to dish out so freely. When I reminded them that growing up, every time I was mistreated, they told me to just suck it up, their faces fell. All 4 cops standing nearby looked visibly uncomfortable and clearly unimpressed with my parents. I'm telling you, if you ever want to put narcissistic parents in their place, confront them in front of law enforcement. It's the one time they'll actually shut up and not try anything stupid. My mother started bawling again and shuffled away. My father stood stiffly, fists clenched, like he wanted to hit me but knew he couldn't. Dan looked utterly defeated, holding his kids like some kind of tragic hero, and Syl was throwing a tantrum on my front lawn like a spoiled child. Soon enough, they all lined up and started hauling boxes out of the house. Luckily, nothing had been unpacked yet, so it went pretty fast. But even while they were moving their things out, my mom kept repeating that it wasn't too late, and I could still do it for Dan. She kept trying to bargain, first saying Dan could pay rent if I let them stay, then suggesting I could move back in with them so Dan could rent the house alone and I wouldn't have to share with them. I told her to shut up and keep packing. I didn't want Dan or his family anywhere near me. I didn't want their money. And I sure as hell didn't want to live with my parents ever again. After how they treated me growing up, any deal with them would feel like making a deal with the devil. Syl lost it again when she heard that. She dropped a box dramatically, sat down on the grass, and threw a full-blown pity party, arms crossed and face scrunched in rage. She didn't help with the rest of the packing and just sulked in place until it was all done. Once they finally got everything out and loaded up into the truck, I gave my parents one last verbal lashing. And with 4 cops present, they couldn't stop me or gaslight me this time. They had no choice but to listen. I called them out for everything, for how they mistreated me growing up, how they let Dan and Syl bully me, and how they didn't even have the decency to let me park my camper when I was homeless, even though they had space. Break. I reminded them how quick they were to ask me for help or offer up my home to Dan rent-free. But when I needed a place, they tried to charge me more than I could afford just to park in their driveway. The cops all gave them side eyes that said exactly what I was thinking. You people are unbelievable. I looked my parents dead in the eye and asked what I had ever done, other than being born, to deserve the way they treated me. I finally had something for myself, something I worked hard to earn, and they immediately tried to take it away for Dan, their favorite. I told them I owed them nothing, and that I wouldn't ask them for anything ever again, because in their eyes I would never be more than a doormat or a bank account. They didn't respond. They just stood there, empty and exposed, with the cops watching everything. So I kept going. I asked what in God's name made them believe they were ever good parents. My dad turned beet red, not with rage this time, but with shame. My mom broke down and sobbed into my father's chest, saying she was a horrible person. I agreed, bluntly and without hesitation. I told her she was a horrible person. So was Dad. So was Dan. I said they all were awful, selfish people, and I hoped karma would deal with them, maybe even hell, if that's what it took. The truth is, if I had said all of this behind closed doors, they would have just gaslit me, flipped the script, and made me feel like I was the problem. But not here, not in front of witnesses. They couldn't hide from the truth. They just stood there in silence as I tore through years of pent-up rage. My mom buried her face deeper into my dad's jacket. My father looked utterly broken. Dan avoided eye contact, helping load the last few things while pretending I didn't exist. Sil never even looked up, just kept sulking in the front seat of the minivan. I checked everything to make sure they hadn't stolen anything, though, honestly, I didn't own much furniture yet. Once it was clear the house was mine again, I watched as they all got into their vehicles. Sil glared at me with pure hatred, like she wanted to say something else but didn't have the words. Dan finally convinced her to drive the minivan away, and as they pulled off, a chance to respond. He told them they had some nerve just showing up uninvited after everything they had done, and that this wasn't their home to walk into anymore. My parents froze in place, clearly not expecting anyone to speak up against them like that. Dan looked embarrassed, like he hadn't thought the plan through, and Sil was clearly just there to stir up drama. As soon as they were gone, earlier that month, I'd taken to social media again to share what had happened, and this time, my parents were too humiliated to even try to defend themselves. Where the family had once been somewhat divided, this incident created a landslide in my favor. Almost everyone took my side, including many I thought wouldn't. Even the former flying monkeys, the ones who used to blindly support my parents, finally came around. It seemed they had seen and heard enough. From that point on, anytime my parents or brother tried to recycle the old "we did it for Dan" excuse, it fell on deaf ears. Whatever support they once had in the family was gone. Not long after, I posted an open invitation to host half the family for Christmas Eve at my house. My parents were very deliberately not invited. Surprisingly, I wasn't blocked on Dan or Sil's profiles. So I saw that Sil gave birth to their fourth child in early November. They're still living at my parents' place. I'm almost certain they knew I was still watching their social media because Sil kept posting passive-aggressive complaints every few weeks about not having enough space while living with her in-laws, probably fishing for guilt or pity, but I wasn't biting. I can only imagine how chaotic my parents' house must be now. 3 rowdy kids, 1 screaming newborn, a mentally unstable Sil, and Dan still playing the golden child. I'm sure my mom and dad are miserable. Maybe they should try living in a camper in their own backyard and let Dan take over their house entirely. I mean, they could do that for Dan, right? Now, to everyone who's asked why I didn't just press charges or have my brother and Sil arrested, the only reason I didn't is because they're parents. Their kids need them. If Dan had been arrested, he likely would have lost his job, and that would have meant no money, no home, no way to care for that new baby. I couldn't do that to the kids, not yet, but jail isn't the only form of revenge. I didn't need a courtroom to make my point, and trust me, they know now. I was merciful once, but more than likely, I never will be again. Break. I waited until after New Year's to make a new account and post this update, just in case more drama unfolded, and sure enough, it did. As I said, Sil kept posting the same tired complaints on social media after the baby was born. She'd just reword them in slightly clever ways, but the core message never changed. She hated living with my parents. The house was too small, and she desperately needed her own place. Blah, blah, blah. And yeah, I know I sound sarcastic and cold about it. But after everything these people put me through, I've earned the right to play my tiny imaginary violin every time she cries for attention. They're toxic, manipulative, and selfish, and they've proven it time and again. So, anyway, back to the party. As I mentioned, I invited half the family to my place for Christmas Eve. It was a long drive, 3 to 4 hours for most of them, but they showed up. They wanted to be there, they wanted to support me, and they did. All night I was praised for how hard I'd worked to get back on my feet. Some even apologized for not understanding what I'd been going through earlier. They asked me why I didn't just take my camper and drive back to them when I was essentially homeless. I had to admit, kind of sheepishly, that I was really attached to this area. My job opportunities were here. My hometown doesn't have much to offer in my field, if anything at all. I wanted to make my own way, and they respected that. The party was genuinely great, the best I'd had in years. Some relatives brought Christmas CDs, and my uncle's Ray Charles album was a standout. Ray sang those carols like no one else. For a moment, I allowed myself to forget the past. I was happy, but of course that peace didn't last. About 2 hours into the party, right in the middle of everyone laughing, eating, and enjoying themselves, they showed up. My parents. My brother. Sil. They didn't even knock. They just walked. Right in like they belonged there. All fake smiles and hands full of wrapped presents. I turned off the music immediately, and I told them, flatly, to get out. They begged to stay, said they brought gifts. But before I could even say a word, one of my uncles, bless him, stood up, pointed at them, and shouted, "You've got some damn nerve walking in here after what you did." Another relative, my uncle, my mother's own brother, took the floor again before anyone else could speak. He looked them dead in the eye and said they didn't deserve to be in my home or in my life after the kind of stunt they'd pulled months earlier. And he wasn't alone. Several other relatives nodded in agreement and backed him up. Now, this uncle used to adore my mom, absolutely loved her. But once he found out the truth about everything that happened between me and my parents, that adoration vanished. Even my grandparents, as old and reserved as they are, didn't hold back this time. They looked my parents in the face and said that if they wanted to make amends with me, it was far too soon, and that they'd never been more disappointed in them than they were this past year. My parents had hidden their favoritism toward Dan from the rest of the family for years, but now the truth was out in the open, and nobody was buying the poor Dan act anymore. My grandparents told them that if they ever wanted to be in my life again, they'd have to seriously start treating me like a son instead of some expendable outsider. Then they turned to Dan and Sil and called them out too, saying they were sick of the repeated, whiny nonsense Sil kept posting online. They told them flat out, my house would not be their new home. Cue Sil's meltdown. She went back to her usual routine, crying and pouting, and whined that she should be living in my house, not me. She plopped into a chair with a dramatic thud and went on about how it wasn't fair. I had a whole house to myself when I had no wife or kids, and she had 4 children who needed space. She said she just wanted to feel like a real mom in a real home. It was petty, but I couldn't help myself. I shot back, loudly, that she sucked as a mom. I pointed out that my mother does most of the parenting while Sil just lounges around, drinking, scrolling on her phone, or running out to spend all of Dan's money. And yet she had the nerve to complain? I took it a step too far, I admit, and joked that I was surprised her baby didn't get drunk from her breast milk, considering how much she drinks. That earned me a few stunned stares, and Sil exploded, demanding to know if I was calling her a bad mother. I calmly said, "The evidence speaks for itself." Then I added that if she actually wanted to move out of my parents' house one day, she might consider dusting off that college degree, getting a job, and learning to manage money. I even reminded her that my mother already handles most of the child care, so once her newborn was a little older, she'd have no excuse. Break. That's when the chaos started. Dan and Syl's oldest kid, just 7 years old, stormed up and started kicking and screaming at me for yelling at his mom. He kept shouting that I was the bad guy who made his mom cry and didn't let them live in my house. Dan quickly pulled his son away, but by then, all the other relatives had jumped back into the fray. What followed felt like a full-on family intervention aimed directly at my brother and Syl. She was crying. The newborn was crying. The other kids were crying. Dan was practically on the verge of tears, too. He slumped down on the ottoman by the front door, the one I keep shoes in, and looked like an absolute wreck. He couldn't even lift his head. He couldn't look anyone in the eye. He didn't say a word to me, not with a house full of family there, ready to judge him the moment he reverted to his golden child behavior. If they hadn't been there, I have no doubt Dan would have tried to order me around again, just like he did months earlier. But now, he was completely humiliated. The damage was done. The masks had come off, and their reputations, his, my parents', and Syl's, were in shambles. No one in the family saw them the same after that. Eventually, they all left, my parents, Dan, Syl, and the kids, in total defeat. And just like that, the party resumed. Nobody really talked about what had just happened for the rest of the night. Most of the adults had been drinking, so they all ended up staying the night at my house. I even let some of them sleep in the camper so there'd be enough room for everyone. Funny enough, it actually worked great as a guest house. Earlier in the evening, a few relatives had asked for a full tour of it, and were amazed I'd lived in it for nearly 2 years. They were full of questions. What summers were like, how I heated it in winter, the whole deal. The next morning, Christmas Day, I was the first one up. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee and laid out some ibuprofen for those who'd had a bit too much spiked eggnog. As people slowly emerged, groggy but grateful, several of them complimented me on being a way better host than my parents had ever been. Before anyone left, we all agreed we'd do this again next Christmas. Same house, same warmth, but without the toxic drama. This time, it was my family, not theirs. After Christmas, Syl finally stopped posting those passive-aggressive digs at me. She even deleted all the old ones, but shortly after New Year's, she slipped up again. She made a new post complaining that she tried to convince my parents to get a camper, just like I had, so they could set it up in the backyard and let Dan and his family use the whole house as their own family home. Ah, the taste of her own medicine must have been bitter, because this time my parents shot that idea down without hesitation. Turns out, no one is going to push them out of their own home, let alone out of the master bedroom. The irony. That post didn't last long. She took it down after a couple of days, and since then, she's barely posted anything. Syl loves to complain, but if a tree falls in the forest and no one's around to hear it, can it still complain? Probably not. I guess she finally realized there's no point in whining when no one's listening anymore. Dan still can't afford to move his family out on his salary alone, and if they end up expecting another kid in the next few years, I wouldn't be surprised at all. But honestly, that's their problem now, not mine. Things have mellowed out for me since all that chaos. I've even started inviting friends over for poker night. I suck at poker. I can never remember the rules, but who cares? We just drink beer, eat junk food, and enjoy being a bunch of loud, happy idiots for a few hours. One time, we loaded up on Whoppers from Burger King and turned the night into the best kind of gathering grown men can have. Stupid fun and getting hilariously drunk without judgment. I'm even thinking about dipping my toes into the dating pool again this summer. I'm not getting any younger, and it might be time to put myself out there again. Fingers crossed that goes well. As for my camper, it just sits quietly in the backyard now. Sometimes I go out there just to hang out. After all, I lived in that thing for 2 years. It feels like a second home. Maybe one day I'll actually get to use it for real camping. Funny enough, I've never been camping before. My parents always thought it was a waste of time, so we never did it growing up. Trying it now would be a whole new adventure for me, and for once, it'd be my kind of adventure, on my terms. Break.